So now that we're done talking about aerobic respiration, we need to circle back around and take a look at what happens during anaerobic respiration. So remember that our cellular respiration has two pathways. Remember, we have the aerobic, which we just talked about, and the anaerobic. And the main difference between the two is whether there is oxygen or not required for the reactions to happen. Now, remember that the first step of both aerobic and anaerobic respiration is glycolysis. But what happens to the end product of glycolysis is going to differ. So remember that during glycolysis, you have a glucose, which is a 6-carbon compound, that gets broken down into 2 pyruvates, which are 3-carbon compounds. Now, if oxygen is present, that pyruvate goes through those remaining steps of aerobic respiration. But now we're going to circle back around and take a look at what happens when oxygen is not present. So if we can't do aerobic respiration, what's going to happen to that pyruvate that we produce during glycolysis? Well, the answer is it's going to go through another series of reactions. So instead of going through the oxidation of pyruvate and the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, instead it's going to go through something called fermentation. Now, it's important to note that the fermentation reactions don't actually produce ATP. So if fermentation doesn't produce ATP, why do we care about it? Why do we care about these fermentation reactions if we don't get any ATP out of it? Because the whole purpose of respiration is to make ATP. So this picture here, if we were actually in the classroom, I would have you sit there with your hands held out to the side. And you can still do this exercise at home if you want to. You'll notice that as you hold your arms out to the side, your arms start to get tired, and it makes it harder to keep them up, and they might even start to get kind of sore and weak, and over time you're going to hit a point where you are not going to be able to hold your arms up. And that's because eventually things like your muscle cells might start doing anaerobic respiration instead of aerobic respiration, and that can actually lead to muscle fatigue. So there are a couple of different fermentation pathways. There's actually lactic acid fermentation, and there's alcohol fermentation. And these different types of fermentation happen in different organisms. But let's take a look at some of the products or what comes out of these reactions before we talk about which organisms do which. But first of all, we mentioned about how muscle fatigue happens because of fermentation, and this happens because of lactic acid fermentation. So human, really any mammal, the muscle tissue, if there's not enough oxygen present to go through aerobic respiration, instead those cells are going to go through anaerobic respiration. And one of the end results is lactic acid, which leads to muscle fatigue. Fermentation also produces a lot of the stuff that we enjoy eating. So for example, yogurt is actually lactic acid fermentation in bacteria. Alcohol is produced from alcohol fermentation in yeast. Bread is also from yeast. Sorry, I did those in reverse order, but now, in addition to that, there are other things like, so like we talked about beer here, we talked about our yogurt, we talked about bread, also stuff like kombucha. So kombucha is actually made using bacteria and yeast that go through these fermentation reactions. Things like sauerkraut and kimchi, these are all things that are produced using these fermentation reactions. So as we mentioned before, fermentation itself does not produce ATP, but remember that glycolysis happens before fermentation. So our anaerobic respiration, we have glycolysis happening first, and glycolysis, remember, makes 2 ATP. And then our second step is fermentation. Now fermentation, like we said, it does not make any ATP. So 0 ATP, which we would think would be a bad thing, right? Because we want to make ATP from these glucose molecules going through glycolysis. But the reason why fermentation is still important is because it actually helps to recycle the materials needed for glycolysis to happen again and again. So if we look here, we've got our glucose going through glycolysis in order to create our pyruvate. And we make some ATP in the process, which remember ATP is energy. We're also making some NADH in the process. So remember NAD plus picks up some electrons from those chemical reactions to form NADH. Now, NAD plus is a reactant of glycolysis, so we have to have NAD plus in order for glycolysis to occur. So what happens is these fermentation reactions play an important role in that they take the NADH and they actually remove those electrons in order to convert it back into the NAD plus, so that glycolysis can happen again. So fermentation itself does not produce ATP, but fermentation takes NADH and oxidizes it back into NAD plus. Remember that oxidation is loss. So NADH loses some electrons in the process, and NAD plus is made as a byproduct. So it basically recycles. So fermentation recycles NADH back into NAD plus, and then that NAD plus can go into another glycolysis reaction. So fermentation is really important because in order for us to make the ATP in glycolysis, we have to recycle that NADH so that glycolysis can happen again. So to summarize our anaerobic respiration, remember that we're starting with an organic compound. So we'll start with our idea of just glucose, which remember is a 6-carbon compound. During glycolysis, that glucose gets converted to pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon compound, and we make 2 of them because glucose is essentially chopped in half. During fermentation, that pyruvate gets converted to an end product, which may be either lactic acid in some organisms, or it might make ethanol and carbon dioxide. During the glycolysis reactions, some ATP is made. So just like we talked about with aerobic respiration, we have to put 2 ATP into the reactions in order to get them started. But we ultimately get 4 ATP produced by those reactions. So we end up with a net of plus 2 ATP made during glycolysis. Now, we also take some NAD plus and we pick up some electrons in order to form NADH. Now, the fermentation reactions do not produce ATP, but what they do is they recycle NADH back into NAD+. And NAD+ is a necessary reactant for glycolysis. So if this doesn't happen, then eventually we're going to run out of NAD+, and glycolysis is not going to be able to happen. So as a reminder, this top arrow up here is glycolysis. This bottom arrow down here is fermentation. And the main goal or reason why fermentation is important is to recycle that NAD plus so that glycolysis can happen again so that we can make more ATP from additional glucose molecules. A couple more facts about fermentation. So it is an anaerobic process, so oxygen is not required for the reactions to occur. Fermentation occurs in the cytoplasm, so we don't need a mitochondrion in order for fermentation to occur. And in fact, things like bacteria don't have mitochondria, but bacteria can do these fermentation reactions. And the end products depend on which organism is going through these fermentation reactions. So some bacteria and the muscle tissue of mammals produces lactic acid. Now, in humans and other mammals, that lactic acid is likely what produces muscle fatigue, which is what makes your muscles weak after a lot of use. In bacteria, that lactic acid is what gives things like cheese and yogurt its kind of tanginess to it. So you can actually make yogurt by taking milk and adding a culture of the right type of bacteria, and the bacteria go through that fermentation reaction to form the lactic acid, which is how you make yogurt. Yeast is a eukaryotic organism. It's a type of fungus. And yeast goes through alcohol fermentation. So it produces ethanol, which is the alcohol found in the alcohols that you drink. And it also makes some carbon dioxide in the process. And that carbon dioxide is actually what makes bread rise as well. So if you're making bread from scratch, you take something like flour and maybe a little bit of sugar, mix it with water and yeast, and the dough rises because carbon dioxide is being produced by the yeast, and that gas gets kind of trapped inside the dough. So now if we compare the amount of ATP that's made, if we look at aerobic respiration versus anaerobic respiration, we can take a look at another main difference between these two types. So remember that aerobic respiration requires oxygen, whereas anaerobic respiration does not. That's one key difference there. The other key difference is that for each glucose molecule that goes through aerobic respiration, we can produce about 34 to 36, somewhere around there, ATP molecules. With anaerobic respiration, for each glucose molecule that goes into the reactions, we only make 2 ATP. So it really comes down to return on investment. So you can imagine that as an organism, it takes energy and time to go find those organic nutrients such as glucose. So if you had to invest time and energy into getting these organic molecules into your body, do you want a return on investment where you get 34 ATP per glucose molecule or only 2? All right, so as humans, we actually really rely on this aerobic respiration. Our bodies can do fermentation, or at least some cells in our body can do fermentation, but it's not enough to keep us alive. So in order for survival, humans have to breathe so that we can take in oxygen so that we can have a much higher efficiency with regards to producing ATP per glucose molecule. Now, not all organisms rely on aerobic respiration. So for example, there are some bacteria that only do anaerobic respiration, and they can survive on that just fine. But humans, that's not the case. Humans have to do at least the majority of the respiration has to be aerobic respiration.